Imagine you are standing in the stone corridor of a Benedictine monastery in the late 12th century. The air is cold, even though it is midday, and the smell of beeswax candles mixes with the faint tang of iron ink. Around you is silence intense, cultivated quiet, broken only by the scrape of quills on vellum. Here, in the scriptorium, time has a different weight. It does not rush, it accumulates. Every monk who copies books begins his day in darkness. The bell tolls long before dawn, and you would rise from your wooden cot, stiff-limbed, and walk barefoot on cold flagstones toward the chapel for matins. This is the first of 7 daily offices, a schedule designed to shape not just the hours, but the very mind. The work of copying books fits neatly between these services. After matins and lauds, a short meal, then the long work stretch until prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and finally compline. These names become the punctuation marks of existence. The scriptorium itself is a room set aside for sacred labor. It is often positioned near the heart of the monastery, where distractions are minimal. The light is poor, filtered through narrow windows of horn or mica, and so candles are lit even at noon. Each monk sits at a slanted wooden desk called a lectern. The desk is just wide enough to hold 1 sheet of vellum, a small ink pot, a penknife. A few also keep a pumice stone to smooth the surface of rough parchment and a little lead stylus to mark faint guidelines before writing. You must imagine the physical labor involved. Vellum does not behave like paper. It resists the quill, especially if not scraped smooth enough, and every letter requires exact pressure. A single blot can ruin an entire leaf. To guard against errors, monks copy letter by letter, not word by word, tracing each character while glancing repeatedly at the exemplar text. This keeps the mind from drifting, though it also slows progress to an agonizing pace, maybe 2 or 3 pages a day for a skilled scribe. Meals are plain and brief, often just bread, broth, and small beer. Speaking is forbidden except at designated times, and most communication occurs through hand signs. This silence is not merely a rule. It is part of the work. Copying is not seen as mere labor, but as prayer. Each word written is an act of devotion, each line an offering. This is why corrections are are considered spiritual failings. If a mistake does slip through, the monk must carefully scrape the ink off with his knife and pray for forgiveness before continuing. The climate is its own enemy. In winter, fingers go numb. In summer, ink dries too quickly. The candle smoke builds up in the lungs and blackens the ceilings. Monks occasionally fall ill from the lead in some pigments or the mold in old vellum. Yet they endure because the work is seen as eternal. The book will outlast the body. The monastery keeps strict records of progress, logging which monk copied which text and when. As though planting seeds for a garden they may never see bloom. And so the hours pass. Bell, toll, prayer, copy, meal, silence, copy again. The sun slides across the stone floor, touching the same grooves it has touched for generations. To modern eyes, this life may seem crushingly monotonous. Yet to the monks, monotony was the point. It erased the self, allowing the words of God, of Aristotle, or Boehisto, seep through like water through cloth. As dusk approaches, the candles burn lower. The monks' eyes blur, and the quills dull. They rise for vespers, their hands still stained with ink. Tomorrow they will return, sit in the same places, and add another few lines to the slow river of words stretching through the centuries. But how did these monks, so isolated and silent, end up preserving the very foundation of Western thought without fully understanding the texts they copied? You return to the scriptorium the following day. The air is no warmer, though the sun glints briefly on the stone walls before fading into soft gray. The monks are already seated, their heads bent low, their hands steady. What they are copying today are not prayers or psalms, but fragments of Cicero's speeches and Aristotle's logic texts that few here can even understand. Is one of the strangest truths about medieval scriptoria. The monks were often transcribing works written in Latin, far more complex than the Latin they knew. They had been trained to copy faithfully, not to interpret. Their task was like moving bricks, one by one, not building the house. They did not need to see the shape of the structure. They only needed to keep the bricks from being lost. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, its infrastructure crumbled, roads rotted, libraries burned, and urban schools closed. The knowledge of law, architecture, and philosophy that had once flowed through public forums shrank into isolated islands. In this vacuum, Christian monasteries became the unlikely custodians of secular learning. A monastery was above all stable. Its walls were thick, its income steady from lands and tithes, and its purpose insulated from the chaos of kingdoms. Even when kings rose and fell, monasteries endured. Inside, the rule of Saint Benedict guided life, emphasizing obedience, humility, and the sanctification of daily labor. Copying books became a way to serve God by preserving the order of creation. The fragments of the old Roman world counted. As part of that order, the monks did not debate whether Aristotle fit with Christian theology. They simply copied him because he was part of the vast inheritance of words. This is why so many classical texts survived at all, not because they were loved, but because they were considered too valuable to allow decay. The monks copied Virgil's Aeneid, Livy's Histories, and Galen's medical treatises with the same quiet discipline they gave to the Gospels. The process of copying a book could span years. First came the preparation of parchment, calfskin soaked in lime to loosen the hair, scraped smooth with curved knives, stretched taut on wooden frames, and dried. It took the hides of dozens of calves to produce a single Bible. Then came the ruling, faint lines scratched with a stylus to guide the text. Only then would the scribe begin the actual writing, dipping his quill every few words, wiping away stray ink with a bit of wool. Colophon's small notes at the end of manuscripts sometimes reveal the psychological toll. One reads, "As the harbor is welcome to the sailor, so is the last line to the scribe." Another simply pleads, "Now I have written the whole thing, give me a drink." When a text was finished, it passed to the rubricator, who added red titles and headings, and then to the illuminator, who painted initials and miniature scenes in the margins. These could be whimsical, rabbits jousting with snails, or profound, like angels kneeling beside a single word. Finally, the book was bound between wooden boards covered in leather, sometimes chained to a lectern to prevent theft. Each step required staggering time. A single, complete Bible might take decades to produce, and yet dozens were being created across Europe at any given moment. The collective patience required is almost unimaginable today. Many of the monks were semi-literate by modern standards. They could copy letters accurately, but not always grasp their meaning. The grammar of Cicero or the metaphysics of Aristotle were far beyond the training of an average scribe, who had been taught only basic church Latin. Meant that knowledge was being preserved without being understood. It is like finding a library written in code and copying it line by line without knowing what any of it says, hoping that someday someone will come who can read it. And someone did. Centuries later, during the 12th century Renaissance, scholars from the newly forming universities rediscovered these old manuscripts in monastery libraries. They brought them back into circulation, translated them, debated them, and reshaped European thought. Thomas Aquinas built Christian theology around Aristotle's logic, which had survived only because generations of silent monks had passed the pages forward like relays in a race they did not know they were running. Sometimes, entire bodies of knowledge hung by a single thread, the sole surviving copy of Lucretius on the nature of things lay forgotten in a German monastery until it was rediscovered in the 15th century. Had one more candle toppled, one more flood seeped through the stones, it could have vanished forever. The monks did not see themselves as heroes of civilization. Most would have been bewildered to learn that they had saved the ancient world. They saw themselves as servants, not saviors. But by treating each word as sacred, even when the words were pagan, they created a bridge across centuries of ignorance and war. Their discipline was their greatest gift. The scriptorium demanded that you suppress boredom, pride, and haste. You did not chase novelty. You sat still, day after day, writing what others had written. In this way, the monks became invisible conduits, through which the thoughts of long-dead authors passed into the hands of people not yet born. As the day ends, the monks rise for Compline, their final prayers whispered in the dark. The scriptorium falls silent again, the quills laid down, the unfinished manuscripts covered with cloth to keep off dust. Outside, kingdoms wage wars neither they nor their books will witness. Inside, the words wait. But how did this slow river of words eventually overflow the monastery walls and reshape the entire intellectual landscape of Europe? Night falls on the monastery. The scriptorium is dark now, its desks draped with cloths, its ink drying in the pots. But imagine the same work being done in hundreds of other monasteries scattered across Europe and Ireland, Italy, Germany, France, and England, each one copying words in near silence, as though they were tending embers through a long winter. For centuries, this light was faint but unbroken, and then something began to change. The knowledge that had been preserved, unintentionally hoarded behind stone walls, started to move. It slipped from cloisters into towns, from monks' hands to merchants' ledgers, and from monasteries to the newly forming universities. The world began to wake up. The first cracks appeared around the 11th and 12th centuries, when Europe began to experience what historians call the 12th century Renaissance. Towns grew larger, trade revived, and the need for trained clerks, lawyers, and administrators surged. Monasteries alone could no longer supply the literate workers society demanded. Cathedral schools, once simple training grounds for clergy, evolved into the earliest universities: Bologna, Paris, Oxford. Their teachers needed books not just scripture, but law codes, medical treatises, and classical philosophy. Monasteries became their suppliers. Students and masters borrowed manuscripts, copied them in urban workshops, and returned them, creating a small but steady circulation of texts. In Italy, a new class of professional copyists emerged. Unlike monks, these men were paid by the page. Their shops became early book rental businesses. Students would rent a pecca, or portion of a book, to copy it themselves. The work that had once taken decades in cloisters could now be done in months in a bustling town. Monasteries, once the sole factories of learning, found themselves part of a wider economy of words. Some embraced it. The Benedictine Abbey at Monte Cassino became famous for its medical manuscripts, while the Cistercians specialized in law texts. Others quietly retreated, their scriptoria fading into ceremonial use as their role shifted from production to preservation. The influx of ancient texts was not just a trickle from monastic libraries. It became a flood. Crusaders returning from the eastern Mediterranean brought Greek and Arabic works. Traders carried manuscripts from Muslim Spain. Jewish scholars translated them into Latin. Yet the only reason this flood could rise at all was that the monks had kept the riverbed intact. The scholars of Paris could only build their towering commentaries on Aristotle because generations of anonymous hands had copied him letter by letter during the long centuries when almost no one cared. This rediscovery did more than feed curiosity. It changed the structure of European thought. Law schools codified Roman legal principles. Medical faculties relied on Galen and Hippocrates. Philosophers used logic sharpened on Aristotle to debate theology. Even commerce benefited. Double-entry bookkeeping and precise contracts required clerks trained to read, write, and copy accurately, skills first drilled in monasteries. By the 13th century, knowledge had escaped the cloister completely. It was loose in the streets, in the counting houses, in the courts. The monks had not tried to spark this revolution, but their ink had laid the fuse. And then came Gutenberg in the 1450s. Johannes Gutenberg's movable type printing press appeared in Mainz. What monks had done in decades could now be done in days. The first printed Bible resembled a manuscript so closely that some buyers added hand-painted initials to make it look familiar. But its implications were radical. Suddenly, books were not unique artifacts chained to desks, but replicable objects. Prices plummeted. Literacy expanded beyond the clergy and elite scholars. Monasteries could not compete. Within a century, most scriptoria closed, their desks abandoned, their silence broken. Some monks welcomed this as the fulfillment of their ancient labor. The words they had carried like fragile seeds were now sprouting everywhere. Others saw it as a loss of control, even sacrilege. If anyone could own a Bible, what would become of authority? The Protestant Reformation would soon answer that question. Using the printing press to shatter the monopoly on religious protection, the monasteries had long upheld. The scribes' age had ended, but their work remained its foundation. There is a quiet paradox at the heart of this story. The monks copied texts to preserve the order of the world as they knew it. Yet, by doing so, they preserved the very seeds that would undo that order. The ancient authors, they safeguarded Lucretius, denying the gods. Aristotle, questioning everything, would inspire humanists, scientists, and reformers to break free from monastic authority. The monks believed they were burying treasure to guard it from decay, but they were planting it. Their boredom built a bridge for ideas that would eventually dismantle the walls around them. And in this paradox lies their true legacy. They showed that knowledge need not be understood to be preserved, that devotion can save what curiosity will later awaken. Their hands cramped and their eyes blurred, so that centuries later someone might read what they could not. You can still see their work today in museums and libraries. Pages that are slightly uneven, where the ink pools faintly at the ends of strokes. Margins where a monk doodled a bored face or wrote, "Oh, my hand." They did not expect to be remembered. They expected the words to be, and they were right. Close your eyes and imagine Europe in the early Middle Ages, around the 10th century. There are no trucks rumbling down highways, no trains shrieking across plains, no refrigerated cargo ships humming over the sea. Yet, scattered across this world of forests, marshes, and fractured kingdoms, people are constantly moving something they call white gold, salt. Salt is so ordinary now that it hides on every table. But in this older world, it was as valuable as silver and as vital as air. It kept food from rotting in the summer, seasoned thin porridge in winter, preserved cheese, cured meat, and even hardened the hides used for shoes and belts. Without salt, survival was impossible. And so, men and women trudged across the continent to carry it where it was needed. Europe's salt did not come from one place. It came from many small, scattered sources, each with its own ancient rhythm. Along the Atlantic coasts of France and Spain, salt was coaxed from seawater in shallow pans called saline. In the Alpine foothills of Austria and Bavaria, miners hacked blocks of salt from mountain veins first formed when ancient seas dried up, leaving a crust of white crystals like snow on dark stone. But most people did not live near these sources. They lived in villages far inland, where the only salt they saw arrived as rough, gray chunks wrapped in cloth or leather. Moving those chunks across the land was the work of generations of traders. Salt was heavy. A single donkey could carry only about 100 kilograms without faltering, and many roads were nothing more than muddy tracks through the forest. This meant transport was slow, seasonal, and expensive. Most caravans moved in late spring or autumn when the roads were firm but not frozen. In winter, the paths disappeared under snow. In summer, the heat spoiled the pack animals, and yet the caravans came. Picture them now, long files of donkeys or mules, their hooves ringing on cobbles, their backs bent under leather sacks, crusted white from leaking crystals. The air smells faintly sharp, like the sea, though the ocean is hundreds of miles away. Bells jingle from the lead animal's neck. A boy walks beside the line, switching mud from their hooves with a stick. This is the medieval supply chain, slow but relentless. Every mile of this journey was shaped by politics. In the patchwork of medieval Europe, every petty count and bishop controlled his own roads and bridges, and each one charged tolls. Caravans might pay dozens of fees between mine and market, and sometimes bribes to avoid confiscation. Bandits were another tax. Salt was light enough to steal, and valuable enough to risk death for. Traders often traveled in convoys, under the guard of hired swords. Some lords granted them safe conduct letters, guaranteeing protection in exchange for a cut of the profits. The danger was constant. In the Alpine passes, avalanches could sweep away whole mule trains. In the forests of Saxony, travelers whispered about salt wolves, bandit gangs who vanished into the trees after ambushes, leaving only scattered hoofprints and torn sacks behind. Because of these costs and risks, salt could double or triple in price between its source and its destination. Merchants grew rich if they could keep their caravans intact. In some towns, such as Lüneburg in northern Germany, entire fortunes were built on salt, funding cathedrals and city walls. The Hanseatic League, the great network of northern merchants, rose partly on the back of the Baltic salt trade, shipping it from Lüneburg to the herring fisheries of Scandinavia. Without salt, those fisheries and the diets of millions would have collapsed. In an age when coinage was scarce, salt sometimes served as currency itself. Peasants might pay their rents in it. Soldiers might receive part of their wages in salt rations. The word salary even comes from the Latin salarium, originally an allowance given to Roman soldiers for buying salt, because it stored well. Salt was a stable medium of value. A lump of iron might rust, a bag of grain might spoil, but a block of salt. Some markets even used standard-sized salt loaves as units of exchange. Traders stamped them with symbols like miniature ingots, and courts treated them like official money. This created an odd paradox. Something consumed daily, like food, was treated like gold, and it shaped habits. Families locked their salt chests. Travelers guarded their personal salt supplies as carefully as they guarded their knives. Monasteries inventoried salt stores alongside sacred relics. Because without salt, even prayerful communities could not survive the winter. Salt also carried symbolic weight. It appeared in Christian rituals as a purifier, mixed into holy water to drive out demons. Newborns were sometimes rubbed with salt to protect them from evil. To spill salt carelessly was to invite misfortune, hence the superstition of throwing a pinch over the left shoulder to blind the devil waiting. These beliefs blurred with the practical. Salt was life, and so it was sacred. Every grain represented not just labor, but survival, the sweat of miners, the trudging of mules, the patient boiling of brine. People feared losing it, not just because of hunger, but because it meant falling out of the great web of exchange that tied the scattered villages of Europe together. Even kings bowed to its power. Charlemagne regulated salt prices across his empire to prevent famine. Later, French monarchs imposed the gabelle, a hated salt tax which funded their wars but helped spark peasant revolts centuries later. Salt could start wars as easily as it preserved bacon. By the end of the first millennium, salt caravans pulsed constantly across Europe like a slow heartbeat. They linked remote alpine mines to coastal fisheries, peasant huts to royal kitchens. They stitched the continent together with thin white threads long before nations existed. It is hard to picture now. But if you could see a medieval trade map glowing with its busiest routes, the salt roads would burn like arteries. They carried more than crystals. They carried stability. Villages could plan winters, markets could flourish. Armies could march only if the salt kept flowing. And yet, this vast system was fragile. One bad harvest, one toll war, one washed-out bridge could cut off entire regions. Communities lived at the mercy of these caravans they never saw, trusting that somewhere beyond the horizon, the donkeys were still moving. But how did these fragile trickles of white gold evolve into the powerful salt empires that reshaped medieval politics and built entire cities on their wealth? Stand at the gates of Lüneburg in northern Germany in the 13th century. The air is sharp with the smell of brine and smoke. Mule trains file in from the surrounding salt marshes, their loads heavy with rough gray crystals. In the marketplace, merchants haggle in Low German and Latin. Guild banners flap from timbered gables. This town, which once barely existed, has become rich enough to build walls, towers, and churches all because of Salt. Lüneburg was not alone. Across medieval Europe, entire cities rose around Salt. What had once been scattered trickles of trade began to coagulate into powerful monopolies, guarded by guilds, fortified by law, and defended by armies. Salt was becoming not just a commodity, but a source of political power. Lüneburg's salt came from underground brine wells, boiled in great iron pans called See Depfanon that hissed day and night. Each pan consumed tons of firewood, stripping the surrounding forests bare, but it produced a steady flood of white crystals. The town organized production with remarkable precision. Pan houses lined the salt street, each owned by a patrician family. Workers stoked the fires, skimmed the crust, packed the salt into barrels, and rolled them to the river docks. From there, barges floated down the Ilmenau River to the Elbe, then on to Hamburg and the North Sea. Most of the salt went north to the herring fisheries of Scandinavia. Preserved with Lüneburg salt, herring became the staple protein of Northern Europe, especially during Catholic fasting periods when meat was forbidden. This demand made Lüneburg fabulously wealthy. Its merchants joined the Hanseatic League, a vast confederation of trading cities stretching from London to Novgorod. Through the League, they negotiated privileges in foreign ports, organized convoys, and set prices. Anyone caught smuggling salt outside the League's control faced ruin. Salt became Lüneburg's life, blood-and its weapon. The town used salt profits to fund mercenaries, build stone walls, and dominate regional politics. What had started as mule loads of crystals trudging through the forest had become the backbone of a maritime empire. Far to the south, in the Alps of present-day Austria, another salt empire thrived. Hallstatt, perched on a narrow lake shore beneath steep cliffs, had been mining salt since prehistoric times. By the Middle Ages, its tunnels wormed deep into the mountain, lit by flickering torches and echoing with hammer blows. Here, the salt was rock, not brine. Miners cut it out in blocks, hauled it up slippery shafts, and loaded it onto carts. This work was brutally dangerous. Shafts collapsed, methane gas exploded, and water seeped in from the lake above. Yet the rewards were immense. The ruling bishops of Salzburg controlled the mines and used their profits to build cathedrals and wield power rivaling secular princes. Salt made these bishops kingmakers. They financed armies, minted coins, and carved trade roads through the mountains. Their caravans rumbled down into Bavaria and across the Danube plain, guarded by armored riders. A simple mineral had turned remote valleys into engines of wealth, and pious clerics into hard-edged merchant lords. In France, the monarchy went further still. By the 14th century, French kings imposed the gabella mandatory salt tax that also forced subjects to buy fixed amounts of salt from royal depots at inflated prices. This gave the crown both revenue and control. The gabelle was wildly unpopular, but incredibly effective. It created a state-run monopoly that funneled millions of livres into the royal treasury each year. Smuggling, called faux sonnage became a national pastime. Armed gabellous salt tax officers patrolled the countryside, searching wagons and chasing down illicit salt traders. This turned salt into a political flashpoint. Peasants despised the gabelle, seeing it as both oppressive and absurd. They could be imprisoned for buying cheaper salt from the next village. Yet the monarchy defended it fiercely, because losing salt revenue meant losing wars. For centuries, French kings balanced their budgets on salt. The system grew so hated that when the French Revolution came, one of its first acts was to abolish the gabelle. It is a strange image. Revolutions sparked by something as small and white as a grain of salt. As these salt powers grew, the roots that fed them became permanent arteries. The Via Salaria in Italy, once a Roman military road, revived as a medieval salt highway. Packed trains clattered down from the Apennines to the markets of Rome in Spain. The salt caravans of Cardona crossed the Pyrenees into France. Towns sprouted at the intersections of these roads. Innsbruck in the Tyrol, Halle in Saxony, Salins-les-Bains in Franche. Their names still echo their origins. Halle and Salz are both old words for salt. Many medieval fairs timed their gatherings to the arrival of salt caravans, ensuring merchants and customers converged at the same moment. These roads were not just paths through the forest. They were threads weaving Europe together. Salt merchants often acted as informal diplomats, carrying news and letters alongside their barrels. They spread coins, languages, and fashions. Some historians argue that the commercial networks built for salt laid the groundwork for the later expansion of trade in wool, wine, and spices. Salt wealth came at a cost. Forests vanished around the boiling towns. Whole valleys filled with toxic brine waste. Miners died young of lung disease, brine burns, or collapsed tunnels. Donkeys dropped dead on mountain roads, their bones whitening beside the trails, and yet the system endured because it worked. Salt made preservation possible, and preservation made population growth possible. It allowed armies to march farther, ships to sail longer, and cities to feed themselves through winter. The white crystals flowing along these roads were not just seasoning, they were civilization's scaffolding. By the late Middle Ages, salt was as essential to politics as to food. Controlling it meant controlling life itself. Those who ruled the salt ruled the map. But how did this intricate, fragile system survive the upheavals of the late medieval period? Plague, war, famine, and emerge into the early modern world intact? The Black Death has reached Europe. Villages stand silent, their hearths cold. Cities echo with the toll of bells for the dead. Fields lie fallow, harvests rot, and the roads grow dangerous. Yet, somehow, the salt trade does not stop. the donkeys still trudge on, their bells muffled by fog. This persistence would prove crucial not just for the survival of the people, but for the survival of the fragile network of commerce that binds medieval Europe together. The plague killed between a third and half of Europe's population between 1347 and 1353. It obliterated labor forces and shattered local economies. Many industries collapsed outright. Cloth production halted, farms lay abandoned, mines flooded. Salt production, however, limped on. At first, it suffered. Like everything else, Lüneburg's pans stood cold for months, and Hallstatt's tunnels filled with water when miners fled. But famine loomed, and with famine came desperation. Survivors needed preserved food more than ever, especially as regular grain harvests failed. Rulers quickly recognized this. In France, the monarchy temporarily suspended tolls on salt shipments to keep them moving. The Hanseatic League organized convoys under heavy guard to prevent banditry. Some monasteries even reopened their ancient salt pans to supply their villages. By the later 1350s, the salt routes were flowing again, though with fewer people along them. Traders found entire towns half empty but still hungry. Salt became a kind of lifeline, proof that something in the world still worked, and something unexpected happened. With fewer mouths to feed, salt supplies per person increased. Prices dropped. What had once been a luxury for peasants, regularly salted meat, salted herring, became accessible to more of the survivors. It was grim progress, bought with death, but it meant that when Europe's population began to recover, the infrastructure for large-scale food preservation was already in place. The plague faded, but war did not. The 15th century brought the 100 Years' War, the Hussite Wars, the Wars of the Roses. Armies marching back and forth across the map often burned what they could not eat. Yet, even as cities were sacked, salt remained a constant. Generals knew that hungry soldiers were useless. Campaign planners devoted huge effort to securing salted rations, beef, pork, and fish that would survive long marches and sieges. Entire salt trains followed armies, guarded as jealously as treasure wagons. Sometimes they were treasure wagons. Looting an enemy's salt stores was a way to starve him into submission. Salt also fed siege warfare indirectly. Besieged cities rationed their salt stocks carefully, because without it, food spoiled and morale crumbled. Chronicles mention defenders boiling down leather straps when meat ran out, seasoning even these scraps with pinches of precious salt. Famines, too, struck regularly. Bad harvests in the 1430s and 1480s sent grain prices soaring. Salt could not create food, but it stretched what existed. A single pig could feed a household through winter if it was salted. Salted fish could be shipped from distant coasts to starving inland towns. In this way, salt functioned as a kind of primitive refrigeration network, a shield against hunger that no ruler dared let collapse. As Europe stabilized after 1500, the salt trade transformed again. The medieval pattern of local monopolies, Lüneburg, Hallstatt, the French gabelle, began to break down under pressure from rising markets and centralized states. Merchants grew more powerful than guilds. Wealthy banking families, like the Fuggers of Augsburg, financed massive salt contracts, leasing entire mines and running them for profit. Instead of mule caravans trudging through forests, fleets of ships carried salt along predictable schedules. Coastal production exploded. Atlantic salines in Brittany, Biscay, and Portugal turned out vast quantities at low cost, undercutting inland sources. This new system was faster, cheaper, and more ruthless. Where medieval salt empires had moved at the pace of donkeys, early modern commerce moved at the pace of capital. Salt became less a symbol of sacred necessity and more a simple commodity, priced by markets and traded like wool or wine. Yet the infrastructure it used, the roads, the depots, the accounting methods had all been built centuries earlier by the patient monotony of the medieval system. The slow heartbeat of the salt roads had prepared the arteries of capitalism. As supply rose and prices fell, salt's cultural aura dimmed. It ceased to be a mark of wealth. By the 17th century, even peasants across much of Europe salted their food daily. Salt was no longer locked in chests or measured out grain by grain. It became invisible through abundance. Ironically, this very success obscured its role. People forgot that their survival had once hung on these white crystals. The great salt cities faded into provincial obscurity. Lüneburg's salt trade dwindled after the Baltic herring fisheries collapsed. Hallstatt's mines kept running, but no longer made kings. Even the French gabelle, once the keystone of royal finance, became an outdated nuisance until revolution finally abolished it. By the dawn of the industrial age, salt was just another thing on the table. Its empire had vanished, leaving only ghostly traces in place names, old roads, and the quiet fact that Europeans could now trust their food to last today. Salt is so common that we rarely think of it at all. But every grain you sprinkle on your dinner carries the weight of centuries, of monks boiling brine in smoky sheds, of donkeys stumbling over alpine passes, of merchants arguing under timbered guildhalls, of smugglers slipping barrels past royal patrols. Salt taught Europe how to build networks, how to move goods safely, how to coordinate prices and enforce contracts. It helped teach people how to trust strangers and how to exploit them. It showed kings how to tax, peasants how to resist, and cities how to thrive. Without salt, there would have been no reliable armies, no urban markets, no continental economy. Salt was the first thread that stitched Europe together, and though its empire has faded, its seams still hold, and so the donkeys have stopped walking, the toll gates have crumbled, and the bandits have vanished into the forests. But the taste of their work lingers on every tongue, silent proof of how something as small as a grain could move mountains, kingdoms, and centuries. Picture Rome at its height in the 2nd century CE. Legionaries are marching on the frontiers. Marble temples glitter in the sun, and markets overflow with grain from Egypt, olive oil from Hispania, and spices from the east. It is a world of triumphal arches, roaring crowds, and vast ambition. But behind the spectacle lies a quieter force. The bookkeepers. They are not celebrated in marble or bronze. You will not see their faces on coins. Yet, without their endless columns of numbers, the empire could not have functioned for a single week. Every road, every army, every amphitheater depended on them. They are the invisible skeleton of Rome. Roman bookkeepers were called rationari and tabulari. They worked in temples, in military camps, and in the great administrative offices called tabularia. Their tools were simple: wax, tablets, styluses, and an abacus, literally a flat board strewn with pebbles calculi. The method was slow but exact. A calculation began by setting pebbles on the board's marked lines for units, tens, hundreds. To add, you moved pebbles left. To subtract, right? Every Roman merchant's stall had such a board, just as every modern shop has a cash register. What mattered more than the math was the habit of tracking everything. The Romans counted obsessively. They counted bushels of grain entering Ostia's warehouses, counted pairs of sandals issued to each legionary, counted tax revenues from each province. The results filled endless wax tablets and rolls of papyrus, which clerks copied, cross-checked, and stored. Every decision the Roman state made: where to build roads, how many legions to deploy, which provinces could bear new taxes, rested on these silent numbers. The empire's sheer size made bookkeeping monumental. At its peak, Rome ruled some 60 to 70 million people. Taxes came in as grain, wine, animals, coin, cloth, even labor. Each type had to be recorded, transported, and converted into usable value. Imagine trying to track not just how much wheat Egypt owed this year, but how much of it had spoiled in transport, how much had been eaten by, and how much should be diverted to feed legions in Syria rather than in Gaul. This required layers of clerks. In every province, the governor maintained an office of tabulari to record contracts, census data, and tribute shipments. These reports flowed back to Rome, where imperial rationary compiled them into massive ledgers. We still glimpse fragments of this system. Surviving papyri from Egypt list precise rations for soldiers, so many modi of barley per man per day, signed by multiple officials. Stone inscriptions on milestones record how many denarii each road segment cost, down to the fraction. This paperwork allowed the empire to act like a single organism, reacting to famine, rebellion, or surplus hundreds of miles away. Without it, Rome's famous roads and legions would have been paralyzed by confusion. Bookkeeping also gave Rome control. To count something was to own it. The census, taken every 5 years, was not just a head count, but an inventory of wealth, land, slaves, livestock, tools. Citizens were ranked by property class, which determined their taxes, their military role, and even their right to vote. This meant that your place in Roman society was literally a line in a ledger. If you gained wealth, clerks moved you up the list. If you lost it, they demoted you. Those who refused the census could lose their citizenship. Taxes were assessed with similar precision. Provincial collectors, called publicani, bid on contracts to gather taxes. They kept meticulous records, which they submitted to the governor's tabularium. Fraud was common, and so Rome buried its taxmen in paperwork to keep them honest or at least predictable. The empire even counted death. Soldiers' deaths were logged to adjust ration. Plagues were tallied to forecast grain needs. Counting turned chaos into something legible, and legibility meant power. All this counting required people, thousands of nameless clerks. Most were freedmen or slaves trained in basic literacy and numeracy. They worked hunched over benches in dim offices, scratching figures by lamplight. Their days blurred into columns of numbers. Mistakes could be deadly. A shipment miscounted could leave a legion starving. A tax error could spark revolt. And so, the clerks built systems of redundancy, double-entry tallies, seals. One man recorded the load of a grain barge, another checked it, a third reconciled their totals. This bureaucracy became self-sustaining. Young clerks apprenticed under older ones, inheriting not just skills but habits, suspicion, caution, and a reverence for accuracy. They were invisible yet essential, like the ligaments holding the empire's muscles together. To the public, this apparatus was mostly unseen. Citizens saw the grandeur of aqueducts and the pomp of triumphal parades, but not the warehouses and counting rooms that fed them. Even the emperors often pretended disdain for money matters, though they depended on them absolutely. This created a strange paradox. The Roman Empire was built on numbers, yet it preferred to celebrate only heroes, generals, and gods. The men who actually made the machine run the tabulari counting grain. The rationary calculating vanished from history almost entirely, and yet their influence was everywhere. They made Rome predictable. They gave it continuity. They let a city on the Tiber manage provinces from the Sahara to Scotland for centuries without collapsing from sheer complexity. But how did these humble bookkeepers shape not just the empire's survival, but its very expansion? And what happened when their numbers began to fail? It is one thing to keep an empire alive. It is another to make it grow. Roman bookkeepers helped do both. Their numbers were not just reflections of the empire, they were engines of its expansion. The ledgers of the tabulary and rationary told emperors where to send legions, how much coin to mint, and which provinces could support new conquests. Rome's wars, its colonies, and even its cultural reach marched behind these quiet figures. Before Rome waged war, it often did its math. When Julius Caesar considered invading Gaul, his staff first reviewed tax rolls and census estimates. They calculated how many bushels of grain the Gallic tribes might provide if conquered, how many troops could be raised locally, and how much silver their mines could yield. These numbers fed directly into his decision. Roman campaigns typically began with requisition tallies. How many pack animals were available? How much grain per soldier per day? How long supplies could last before resupply? Only when the sums balanced would the Senate authorize the expedition. The same logic extended to garrisons. After conquest, rationary calculated how many soldiers a province could support without draining Rome's core granaries. This is why some provinces, like Egypt, hosted only small Roman forces, despite their wealth. The ledgers dictated the risk. Even the shape of Roman roads followed numbers. Military surveyors plotted routes based not just on geography but on expected maintenance costs in denarii per miland, estimates of how many supply wagons could travel them each month. Expansion was, at its root, an accounting problem solved in advance. At the center of this machine stood the Roman state treasury, housed in the Temple of Saturn at the foot of the Capitoline Hill. Here, clerks tracked the entire empire's income and spending on scrolls stacked like cordwood. Gold and silver ingots lay in guarded vaults, but the real treasure was information. Lists of tax receipts from Africa, contracts for shipbuilding in Ostia, grain subsidies for the urban poor. The aerarium used what we might now call budgeting. Clerks forecast future revenues, compared them to current obligations, and advised the Senate on whether to raise new taxes or debase the currency. These forecasts shaped imperial policy. When revenues ran short, emperors often postponed wars or ordered mass sales of state assets, decisions that began not with battlefield defeats but with red ink on a scroll. Augustus himself spent much of his reign personally reviewing accounts, famously boasting that he found Rome a city of brick and left it marble, but only because his clerks showed him how much marble he could afford. The provinces were where bookkeepers turned conquest into stability. Province kept its own tabularium, staffed by Roman-trained clerks. They collected taxes in kine grain, livestock, oil land, converted them into usable supplies for the army. A shipment from Africa might be recorded first as 50,000 bushels of wheat, then as so many rations, then as so many denarii of state credit. This conversion work was vital. Without it, the empire would have drowned in incompatible local systems. Instead, bookkeeping created a common imperial language of value. A donkey in Syria could be compared to a bushel of grain in Gaul because both were translated into Roman numbers. The clerks also enforced fairness, or at least uniformity. Provincial governors who skimmed taxes were audited on arrival in Rome. Surviving papyri from Egypt show these audits in action. Itemized lists comparing expected revenues to actual receipts, with missing amounts circled in red. Fraud meant exile or execution. Thus the numbers became Rome's leash. They bound distant provinces to the center more tightly than legions could. A rebellious governor might defy an army, but he could not hide from the books. Bookkeeping also fed Rome itself. The city's population topped 1 million at its peak, an unprecedented size for the ancient world. Feeding it required moving over 150,000 tons of grain per year, much of it from Egypt and North Africa. This was the unknowna, the grain dole, distributed monthly to hundreds of thousands of citizens. Coordinating this operation demanded extraordinary accounting. Every shipment had to be tracked from field to harbor, to warehouse to bakery. A single clerical failure could starve whole districts. The system ran like clockwork because of ledgers. Clerks at Ostia logged every arriving grain barge, noting its weight and quality. Warehouses kept daily stock counts. Bakeries filed flour output reports. Supervisors reconciled all 3 sets of numbers to prevent theft or spoilage. Rome's famous bread and circuses rested not on bread alone, but on bookkeeping. Without it, the capital would have emptied from famine long before barbarian invasions arrived. Yet this system had a hidden flaw. It depended on continuous, meticulous human effort. There were no calculators, no automatic audits, no backups. Every number had to be correct the first time. This made the empire brittle. Corruption could quietly hollow it out. Miscounts could leave legions unpaid, triggering mutinies. Falsified grain reports could create phantom surpluses that vanished when famine hit. Roman administrators knew this and lived in constant anxiety over their books. Letters from provincial governors begged Rome for more clerks, more ink, more papyrus, anything to keep the machine running. And when the machine faltered, the cracks spread fast. In the 3rd century, during the crisis of the empire, inflation soared as emperors debased the currency to pay troops. Prices rose faster than clerks could adjust their ledgers. Taxes became chaotic, supply chains broke, and the accounting system began to seize. Armies deserted not for lack of loyalty, but for lack of predictable pay. The empire was discovering that numbers could conquer, but they could also collapse. If the bookkeepers had been the empire's skeleton, that skeleton was starting to creak under its own weight. But how did Rome's bookkeepers try to adapt when their numbers began to fail? And could they save the empire from its own complexity? It is the 3rd century CE, and Rome is cracking. The empire that once felt eternal is fraying at its edges. Germanic tribes raid across the Rhine. Persia pushes from the east, and plagues sweep through the cities. Emperors rise and fall within months, assassinated by their own guards. Armies mutiny. Provinces rebel. But beneath the chaos, something quieter is happening in the counting rooms. The numbers are breaking. For centuries, the Roman system of bookkeeping had rested on 3 pillars: stable currency, predictable taxes, and a functioning bureaucracy. All 3 began to fail at once. Coinage was the first crack. To pay restless legions, emperors began debasing the silver denarius, reducing its silver content while stamping it with the same face value. At first, this created more coins, but inflation soon spiraled. Prices doubled, tripled, then became meaningless. Bookkeepers struggled desperately to keep up. Ledgers filled with crossed-out figures and frantic recalculations as clerks tried to adjust wages, taxes, and contracts. But the numbers no longer described reality. At the same time, civil wars disrupted tax collection. Provinces stopped sending reliable shipments of grain and gold to the capital. Local officials, fearing plunder, hoarded supplies instead of recording them. The smooth flow of information that had bound the empire together became a jumble of gaps, contradictions, and lies. The rationary could no longer produce clear forecasts. The state began making blind guesses. Armies marched with empty wagons. Cities starved while distant warehouses overflowed. The empire had grown too large, and its accounting too fragile. The skeleton was snapping. Some emperors tried to repair the system by sheer force. Diocletian, ruling at the turn of the 4th century, launched a radical overhaul. He divided the empire into smaller administrative units, each with its own tax office and clerks. He ordered a massive new census, counting not just land and people, but fruit trees, beehives, and even windows, anything that could be taxed. He also tried to freeze the collapsing economy in place. His famous edict on maximum prices, fixed wages, and prices for thousands of goods, attempting to anchor the spiraling inflation. Bookkeepers were ordered to enforce it down to the last loaf of bread. The effort partly worked. Taxes stabilized, and the empire staggered back onto its feet. But the cost was staggering bureaucracy. Records multiplied. Farmers fled their land to escape the census. Clerks were chained to their jobs for life, forbidden to leave their posts. The Roman ledger system had become a cage necessary, but suffocating. Diocletian's reforms paved the way for Constantine, who built an even more rigid financial machine. He replaced the broken silver currency with the solid gold solidus, which held its value for centuries. Taxes were now assessed in kind, grain, animals, cloth, and converted into gold quotas at fixed rates. This allowed the state to ignore local price swings and fund its armies consistently. Constantine also expanded the imperial bureaucracy dramatically. Thousands of new clerks flooded the provinces, demanding records, receipts, and oaths. Ledgers became thicker than ever, sometimes listing the exact number of mules in each village. This restored stability, but at a cost. The empire's economy, land and labor, were locked into fixed categories, so taxes could be predicted. Peasants could not leave their farms. Sons had to inherit their fathers' professions. This rigidity preserved the books at the expense of freedom. Rome had survived by turning its bookkeeping into chains. For a while, the system held. The Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, inherited Constantine's machine and kept it running for centuries. The Western Empire did not. As the 5th century approached, the western half of the empire bled money and manpower. Armies were filled with mercenaries who ignored Roman pay schedules. Tax bases shrank as provinces seceded or were conquered. The records grew patchier until, in some regions, they simply stopped. When the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410, they burned storehouses and palaces, but also the archives. The loss of ledgers was as deadly as the loss of soldiers. Without them, the state could not tell who owed what, where supplies were, or even how many troops remained alive. By the time the Western Empire officially fell in 476, its counting rooms were already silent. The pebbles had stopped moving, and yet, though their system collapsed, the Roman bookkeepers left deep grooves in history. Medieval kings later copied Roman fiscal methods, censuses, tax ledgers, audits, sealed receipts. The Catholic Church borrowed Roman administrative structures for its own vast records of tithes and lands. The idea that a government should track everything's souls, coins, cattle came from Rome. Even modern accounting bears their imprint. Double-entry bookkeeping emerged in medieval Italy, partly to solve the same problem. Roman clerks faced how to catch errors by redundancy. The word calculate itself comes from calculus, the little pebbles. They slid across their boards. Their work outlived their empire. There is a quiet lesson in their story. Rome did not fall from barbarian swords alone. It also fell because its numbers stopped working, because its information became too tangled for its people to untangle. The bookkeepers built the empire by making it legible. When their ledgers failed, the empire became invisible to itself. Armies, provinces, taxes, even people dissolved into guesswork. They were invisible men, yet they held up the world. And when their columns collapsed, so did everything above them. Even now, when you open a spreadsheet or sign a receipt, you are touching their ghost work, the silent, relentless urge to count the world into order. It was Rome's truest invention. It is early morning in Nuremberg, around the year 1350. The streets are narrow, the air sharp with the smell of tanned leather and coal smoke. A bell tolls from the church of St. Sebaldus, calling the city to prayer. You pause to listen, not just to the sound, but to the fact that it is regular, measured, predictable. In most of Europe, time is still reckoned by nature, dawn and dusk, seasons and shadows. But here, something new is taking shape. Behind a small wooden door off the main market square, a blacksmith turned tinkerer is crouched over a bench, filing gear teeth by candlelight. He is building a machine that will slice the day into equal pieces something no one has ever truly done before. He is building a clock. For most of human history, time was fluid. Medieval peasants rose when it was light and slept when it was dark. Days were divided into rough blocks, named for church services, matins. Summer hours stretched long. Winter ones shrank to slivers. Even in towns, bells were rung by eye. A watchman would climb the church tower, squint at the sun, and toll the bell when he judged the time about right. No one expected precision. An hour might mean anything from 40 to 90 minutes, depending on the month. This vagueness shaped medieval life. Labor was measured by tasks, not minutes. Weed this field, mend these shoes, copy this page. Wages were paid by the day. Markets opened when sellers arrived and closed when they left. Few people knew exactly what time it was, and fewer cared. But commerce was changing that. By the 14th century, Europe's cities were swelling with merchants, bankers, and guild workshops. Their lives depended on coordination, meetings, deadlines, contracts. They needed time they could trust. And so, the first mechanical clocks appeared. The key breakthrough was mechanical escapement. Around the 1270s, inventors in Northern Europe developed the Virgin Foliot mechanism, a vertical rod, the verge, with two small metal pallets that rocked back and forth, catching the teeth of a gear and releasing them one at a time. This regulated the gear's rotation, making it move in steady steps. Before this, no machine could count equal intervals on its own. Water clocks could freeze in winter. Sand clocks clogged. Candle clocks burned unevenly. The verge escapement created the first self-sustaining rhythm. Early clockmakers mounted these mechanisms in iron frames as big as cupboards, powered by heavy weights on ropes. As the weights descended, they turned gears, which drove a large hand around a dial or rang a bell. First known public mechanical clocks appeared in the 1280s and 1290s in England, France, and Italy. But Nuremberg soon became one of their true cradles. Its thriving metalworkers and merchants provided both the skills and the demand. By the 14th century, Nuremberg was one of the richest cities in the Holy Roman Empire. It sat on the crossroads of major trade routes and thrummed with crafts, armorers, goldsmiths, tanners, printers. Its merchant guilds needed strict schedules to coordinate shipments and contracts. So, the city embraced mechanical clocks with unusual enthusiasm. Its council funded clockmakers to install large public timepieces on churches and guild halls. Soon, bells tolled the hours over the marketplace, dividing the day into equal blocks for everyone. This changed the rhythm of life. Shopkeepers began opening at fixed hours. Courts held hearings on set schedules. Apprentices were expected to arrive by the first hour rather than after dawn. Even the city gates opened and shut by the clock for the first time. Nuremberg's citizens began to think of time as something external, measurable, and shared rather than personal and elastic. The city had synchronized itself to a machine. The clockmakers themselves became local celebrities. Their work combined blacksmithing, fine metalwork, and mathematics, and they guarded their techniques closely. They filed gears from wrought iron by hand, hardened them in charcoal forges, and assembled them with hammer-driven rivets. Every gear tooth had to be shaped perfectly, or the whole machine would jam, because escapements were finicky. Early clocks often lost or gained an hour per day. Clockmakers compensated by making them massive. The inertia of huge gears and weights helped stabilize their motion. Some early clocks weighed hundreds of kilograms and filled entire rooms. Yet their imprecision did not matter. The key thing was that they ticked steadily. They divided the day into 24 equal hours, an idea so novel that people found it slightly unsettling. Hours no longer stretched or shrank with the sun. They were all the same, and they belonged to the clock. This mechanical time began seeping into daily consciousness. Medieval sermons warned people to redeem the time, counting their lives like coins. Merchants scheduled meetings to the hour. Guild rules fined apprentices for being late. Over generations, people internalized the ticking of the gears. This was not just a technological change, it was a mental one. Before clocks, time had been organic and subjective. After clocks, it became abstract, external, something that could be measured, divided, and even wasted. This new sense of time discipline would eventually transform work itself, laying the psychological groundwork for wage labor, timed shifts, and industrial schedules centuries later. But it began here with the clatter of iron gears in Nuremberg. Public clocks also became political tools. City councils flaunted them as symbols of order and modernity. A reliable clock showed that a city could control not just people, but time itself. In some towns, rival guilds competed to build more elaborate clocks on their halls, complete with moving figures of saints or automatons that struck the bells. Nuremberg's council saw its clocks as proof of civic pride and technological leadership. The bells were not just telling time, they were announcing who ruled. It, standing in the market square of Nuremberg as the hour bell, you feel the gears echo under your feet. Time itself seems to have changed from water slipping through your hands to iron ticking in place. But how did these massive public machines evolve into the small, precise personal clocks that reshaped daily life even more profoundly? Stand again in Nuremberg a few decades later, around the year 1450. The city is louder now. Merchants shout from stalls, blacksmith hammers ring like bells, and actual bells toll the hours from every direction. Time has become part of the air. But something new is happening behind workshop doors. Clockmakers are shrinking their machines. The great public clocks that once filled rooms are becoming small enough to sit on a table or even to be carried. Time, which once belonged only to cities, is about to become personal. Nuremberg's metalworkers were among the most skilled in Europe. By the mid-15th century, they were experimenting with spring-driven mechanisms that no longer needed heavy hanging weights instead of pulling gears downward. These clocks used tightly coiled steel springs to push gears forward. This made them compact enough to be enclosed in brass boxes the size of a loaf of bread. Known as table clocks or Tischuhren, they could sit on desks, altars, or bedside tables. Spring power solved one problem size but created another. Springs delivered uneven force as they unwound, speeding up and slowing down the clock. Nuremberg craftsmen compensated with a new mechanism called a cam that pressed against the spring to even out its power. These devices were still crude by modern standards, often losing an hour a day. but they were revolutionary. For the first time, an individual could own the hours. Not just here. Them owning a personal clock became a mark of wealth and sophistication. Merchants displayed them on their counting tables. Nobles carried them to show off their cosmopolitan taste. Some were shaped like towers or miniature churches, gilded and engraved with zodiac signs or biblical scenes. The city's clockmakers grew rich and famous. Their guild regulated apprenticeships, protected secrets, and staged public competitions. Names like Peter Henlein, who worked in Nuremberg around 1500, became renowned across Europe for crafting small, spring-driven clocks so compact they could be worn on chains. Henlein is often credited somewhat mythically with inventing the watch. These miniature marvels were more art than utility. They were wildly inaccurate, needing daily winding and constant adjustment. Yet their symbolism mattered more than their precision. They said, "I control time. I carry it with me." Time had become not just a public order, but a private possession, as clocks spread from guild halls to private homes. They reshaped daily life more subtly than the great public timepieces ever had. Wealthy households began regulating routines by the hour. Servants were expected to appear at set times. Meals were served at 8 rather than after morning prayers. Scholars timed their reading and writing sessions. Doctors timed their visits. Even monasteries long ruled by the bell-adopted mechanical clocks to sharpen their schedules. Monastic rules that once allowed loose seasonal hours tightened into fixed intervals. This creeping regularity spread through the merchant classes. Contracts began specifying hours as well as dates. Workshops imposed fines for tardy apprentices. Markets opened and closed at precise moments. People were learning not just to hear the hours, but to obey them. The gears were moving inside their minds. One of the most profound shifts was the standardization of time itself. Before clocks, an hour meant different things in different places and seasons. Now, mechanical clocks divided the day into 24 equal segments everywhere, regardless of sunlight. Cities synchronized their public clocks to each other to coordinate trade. Merchants traveling between Nuremberg, Augsburg, and Venice could trust that an hour meant the same thing in each. This made long-distance contracts and schedules possible in a way they had never been before. Time had become a universal currency, as measurable as coin and just as powerful. The table clocks of Nuremberg also transformed craft itself. Their makers blended blacksmithing, goldsmithing, and fine engraving in a way few trades had done before. They forged tiny gears, blued steel springs, inlaid brass cases with silver, and etched miniature celestial maps on dials. Each clock embodied hundreds of hours of labor and the accumulated knowledge of generations. They were microcosms of the city's economy. Metal from Saxony, charcoal from Franconian forests, glass from Bohemia, skill from every corner of the guild system. To own one was to hold a fragment of the whole city in your hand. Time made tangible at these personal clocks ticked on desks and mantels. They eroded the last remnants of the old task-based sense of time. No longer did people simply work until the job is done. They worked until the clock said stop. The clock's impartial ticking became the silent overseer of labor, marking not effort but duration. This idea that time is a quantity to be spent would shape the entire future of work. It was a seed planted here in the brass boxes of Nuremberg. Now, for the first time in history, a person could carry time in their pocket and feel its weight. But how did these fragile, spring-driven machines evolve into the robust, precise watches and clocks that would eventually rule the rhythms of the entire modern world? It is now the early 16th century. The old bell towers of Nuremberg still toll the hours over the market square. But the city hums with something faster, tighter, more measured. Time has left the towers. It ticks on tables, dangles from chains, and beats in the minds of merchants and craftsmen. The clockmakers have won, and their victory is about to reshape the entire world by the 1510s. Nuremberg craftsmen were building the first true portable watches, miniature, spring-driven clocks enclosed in drum-shaped brass cases just a few inches wide. These were sometimes called Nuremberg eggs. Though they were actually round rather than egg-shaped, they had only a single-hour hand, since their accuracy was rarely better than 15 minutes per day. But they could be worn on a chain or carried in a pouch, wound daily like a pet, and consulted at will. Owning one was like possessing a personal sun that no cloud could hide. This changed something profound. Time was no longer just a shared rhythm of bells. It became an individual possession. A person could now measure their day without reference to the city around them. Time had detached from place. These watches were still luxury items, but their influence spread far beyond their numbers. They injected the idea that punctuality was a virtue in itself. Merchants who kept exact appointments were praised as trustworthy. Workshops rewarded workers who arrived on the dot. Scholars timed their lectures. Even duels began at fixed hours rather than at dawn. Punctuality became social capital. To be late was to be careless, even dishonorable. This pressure for precision pushed the technology forward. Clockmakers experimented with new escapements, better springs, and jeweled bearings to reduce friction. By the late 1500s, accuracy improved to within minutes per day, a remarkable leap. Time had become something people competed to control. Nuremberg remained a center of innovation, but its techniques spread quickly through Europe. Augsburg, Blois, and Geneva became rival hubs. Protestant refugees carried clockmaking secrets from Germany to Switzerland, where Calvinist austerity banned jewelry, so artisans turned their goldsmithing skills toward watches instead. By the 17th century, Swiss watchmakers were producing the finest timepieces in Europe, descendants of Nuremberg's brass eggs, but now accurate to the minute. Wealthy nobles across the continent wore them as symbols of discipline and prestige. What had begun as an eccentric craft in one German city was becoming a pillar of European commerce and identity. As clocks and watches became more reliable, they colonized work itself. Guild workshops that once measured labor by output began paying by the hour. Apprentices punched in and out on the sound of the bell. Factories, still rare, but multiplying organized shifts around precise schedules. Time had become a unit of currency. Labor was no longer just effort. It was measurable slices of life, bought and sold like cloth or grain. This was a profound shift in human thinking. Medieval people had seen time as a flow. Now it was becoming a resource. To waste time was to waste money. To save time was to grow rich. This mental framework would eventually drive the Industrial Revolution, but its seed lay here. In the gearwork of Nuremberg, clocks also gave power to those who owned them. City councils used them to enforce curfews. Schools used them to regiment lessons. Monasteries tightened their already rigid schedules. Even households began to enforce punctual meals and bedtimes. People who controlled the clocks could control others. The rhythm of the gears became the rhythm of society by the 17th century. This discipline was so internalized that people spoke of having an inner clock. The idea that humans should align with machines rather than the other way around had quietly taken hold by then. The older, task-based sense of time had nearly vanished from cities. No one said work until dark anymore. They said work until 6. Bells no longer just marked prayer, they marked obligations. The clock had replaced the sun as the measure of the day. Only in remote villages did people still live by nature's time. But even there, itinerant merchants carried watches, and traveling magistrates arrived at the 3rd hour, forcing locals to adjust. The clock's grip widened year by year. Time had become universal and inescapable. Nuremberg's clockmakers did not set out to change human consciousness. They wanted to solve problems of metal and motion. Yet their creations reshaped how people imagined their lives. They made time visible, then portable, then compulsory. They turned hours into things discrete, countable. They laid the foundation for schedules, wages, deadlines, and the entire machinery of modern life. The medieval world had been ruled by seasons. The modern world would be ruled by seconds, and it began here. With a few patient men filing iron gears in a smoky workshop above the cobblestones. The air is cold and smells faintly of lanolin, the natural oil that clings to sheep's wool. You are standing inside a timber-framed house in a 14th century town somewhere in Flanders. The room is dim, except for the thin gray light slanting through leaded glass windows. A loom stands in the center like a wooden skeleton, its vertical beams blackened by years of candle smoke. A woman is already working it, her feet pressing treadles in slow rhythm, her hands throwing the shuttle back and forth through taut warp threads. The steady clack of the loom is the heartbeat of her life. This is the world of the medieval weaver. Long, repetitive, and quietly vital, cloth was not just clothing, it was currency, status, and survival. In much of Northern Europe, especially in the Low Countries, England, and parts of Italy, textiles formed the backbone of the economy. Everyone needed cloth, peasants for tunics and blankets, nobles for fine wool and silk, merchants for sails and sacks, monasteries for robes and altar cloths. Cloth did not rot like food or rust like iron. It could be stored, traded, taxed. Towns grew rich on it. By the 14th century, Flanders had become the epicenter of the wool trade. English sheep supplied raw wool, Italian merchants brought dyes and alum, and Flemish weavers turned it all into fine cloth, prized from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. But at the base of this vast web was the single household loom, where workdays stretched from before dawn to after dark. The loom is the weaver's universe. It is a large wooden frame, taller than a person, with hundreds of vertical warp threads strung tightly from top to bottom. Each warp thread passes through an eyelet on a heddle, and the heddles are attached to treadles on the floor. Pressing a treadle lifts half the threads. Releasing it lowers them, opening a gap called the shed. Through this gap, the weaver throws the shutula, wooden spindle wrapped with weft thread, then beats it into place with a heavy swinging bar called the beater. Each pass of the shuttle adds a single line to the cloth. The work is physically demanding. The weaver sits upright all day, shoulders tight, feet pumping the treadles, hands darting in and out. A lapse in rhythm can tangle threads or create flaws. Even a skilled weaver might produce only a few inches of fine cloth per day. Mistakes are merciless. A broken warp thread must be tied with a weaver's not thinner than the surrounding fibers. A missed shed creates a flaw that might ruin the whole bolt. Every motion matters. The weaver's day begins before sunrise. She eats a crust of bread, lights the tallow lamp, and warms her stiff fingers by the small hearth. By first light, she is at the loom. She works in silence. The room is too small for anyone else. Children are shooed outside to spin wool or wind bobbins. The only sound is the clack and thump of the loom. Around midday, she stops briefly to eat cheese, onions, rye, bread, and stretches her aching back. Then she works again until dusk. The fading light is her enemy. Candlelight flickers too much to see fine threads clearly. As the room dims, she works faster, racing the dark. When the last threads vanish into shadow, she ties off the warp, drapes the half-finished cloth in linen to keep off dust, and steps away on trembling legs. The day has been consumed by cloth, as it will be again tomorrow. The visible weaving is only the final stage of an enormous hidden labor before the weaver can sit at the loom. Someone must shear the sheep, wash the greasy wool in warm urine or lye, beat it to loosen fibers, card it with iron-toothed combs, spin it on a spindle into yarn, and wind that yarn onto bobbins. This is slow, exhausting work, usually done by children, servants, or poorer women. Their labor vanishes into the finished cloth like buried roots feeding a tree. Warp threads, especially, must be flawless. A single weak strand can snap under tension, ruining days of work. So warp yarn is spun tighter and plied thicker than weft yarn, then soaked in gluey sizing to stiffen it before weaving. Preparing a single warp can take weeks just to create the blank canvas the weaver will spend more weeks filling every bolt of cloth that leaves this house. Represents months of human effort condensed into something soft enough to fold. The weaver is not just making clothing. She is producing wealth. Town authorities inspect and stamp every finished bolt of cloth to certify its quality. Merchants buy it at the town market, often through guild intermediaries, and resell it across Europe. The price she receives depends on dozens of details: fiber quality, thread count, dye fastness, even the width of the cloth regulated by law to fit standard looms. Guilds strictly enforce these standards. A bolt that is too narrow or loosely woven can be confiscated or cut apart. Fines are steep. Repeat offenders lose their looms. This pressure makes weaving both secure and stressful. The weaver is part of a powerful commercial system, but she has no margin for error. Her livelihood depends on threads she can barely see. Weaving also weaves people. The household loom binds the family together in a small economy. Older children spin yarn, younger ones wind bobbins. The husband buys wool and sells finished cloth. The wife weaves. Even neighbors are involved. Dyers, fullers who shrink and thicken cloth with heat and soap. Shearers who trim the surface smooth. And merchants all depend on her output. Every clack of her loom echoes through the town's economy. If her loom falls silent, someone else goes hungry. Yet she herself rarely leaves the room where she works. The world passes by her window while she pulls the shuttle back and forth. Measuring her life in threads, each day ends with a bolt of cloth a few inches longer and a body a little more worn. But how did this small domestic craft grow into the sprawling, industrialized textile networks that came to dominate Europe's economy in the centuries that followed? The loom creaks as you sit before it again the next morning. The light is weak, the air damp from the North Sea winds that creep through the cracks in the shutters. The shuttle slides back and forth, back and forth. It is easy to forget, as the threads accumulate slowly under your hands, that this tiny room is part of something vast, something reshaping the economy of Europe. The household loom is about to become part of a city by the 14th century. Weaving was no longer just a rural cottage craft. Entire towns had reoriented themselves around textiles, especially in Flanders, Brabant, northern Italy, and southern England. Towns like Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres roared with looms. Their population swelled with rural migrants seeking work. Narrow streets echoed with the thump of fulling hammers and the hiss of dye vats. Canals ran purple, red, and blue from spilled madder and woad. Each step of production shearing, spinning, weaving, fulling, dyeing, shearing again. Stretching on tentar frames was done by different specialists. A single bolt of cloth might pass through a dozen hands. The weaver, who once controlled the whole process, now became a link in a long chain. This division of labor increased speed and quality, but it also created dependence. The lone weaver could no longer survive alone. She was now part of an industrial ecosystem. To manage this complexity, towns turned to guilds. Weavers' guilds organized production, set prices, and enforced quality standards. They regulated who could set up a loom, how many apprentices each master might have, and even the width of the cloth each loom must produce. Guild inspectors measured every finished bolt with standardized rods. If it was too narrow or loose, they slashed it with knives and fined the weaver. Guild mark small lead seals were attached to approved cloth-like passports. Joining a guild was mandatory in most towns. To join, a weaver had to complete a years-long apprenticeship, then work as a journeyman for wages under a master. Only after presenting a masterpiece of flawless cloth could they open their own shop. Guilds gave stability, but they also crushed flexibility. Innovation was often resisted as a threat to established rules. A weaver who tried to use a new weave structure or mechanical improvement could be fined or expelled. The loom house had become a cog in a bureaucratic machine. Behind these guilds stood an even larger force, the wool trade. English sheep produced the finest wool in Europe, plong, soft and strong. English merchants exported it in massive bales to the Low Countries, where Flemish weavers turned it into luxury cloth. Italian bankers financed the shipments and sold the finished cloth at fairs from Champagne to Venice. This triangling wool, Flemish weaving, Italian finance dominated Europe's economy. Monarchs taxed it heavily to fund wars. The 100 Years' War itself partly revolved around control of the wool trade routes through Flanders. And yet, at the center of this geopolitical machinery sat the solitary weaver, feet on her treadles, hands on her shuttle, binding the empire's wealth one thread at a time. Life for an urban weaver was both better and harder than for her rural ancestors. She had access to better wool, faster sales, and guild protections. She might even work in a shared workshop with several looms and hired apprentices, raising her output enormously. Some weavers grew wealthy enough to buy stone houses or serve on town councils, but competition was fierce. Guild quotas capped how much each workshop could produce, and fines for mistakes were harsh. Rent and raw wool prices rose constantly. Debt was common. She worked longer hours than ever, 12 to 14 a day, because now time meant money. The loom that once marked the slow rhythm of seasons now marked the relentless pace of the market. Even as weaving moved into cities, much of its invisible labor still happened elsewhere. Poor rural women spun yarn for low wages, sending skeins into town by children picked burrs from fleece or turned the great fulling hammers. Dyers stood knee-deep in steaming vats that stained their hands for life. Urban prosperity rested on this hidden countryside of labor. The city weaver might seem independent, but her livelihood depended on an entire web of unseen workers. If the spinners failed, her loom stood empty. As weaving became central to urban economies, the loom became a symbol of civic pride. Town seals bore images of looms. Guild halls were decorated with carved shuttles and warp beams. Flanders cities held elaborate processions featuring giant symbolic looms on wheels. Cloth wealth built cathedrals, hospitals, and universities. Merchant families who grew rich on weaving sponsored churches, endowed altars, and married into nobility. The loom had once been a tool of survival. Now it was an engine of social mobility. Yet, for all this grandeur, the weaver's own life remained constrained by the machine she served. The guild system that gave her protection also fixed her place. But how did this tightly controlled medieval weaving world give way to the explosion of innovation and mechanization that would eventually transform textiles and work itself forever? The loom creaks under your feet, but outside, the world is changing. It is now the late 15th century. The weaving towns of Flanders and northern Italy are rich, their merchants building palaces, their guilds filling cathedrals with stained glass. Yet beneath this splendor, the weaving system is straining. For centuries, cloth has been the quiet skeleton of Europe's economy. But that skeleton is about to break and reform into something new. By the 1400s, the guild system that once organized and protected weavers had become rigid and restrictive. Guilds limited the number of looms each master could own, the number of apprentices he could train, and the kinds of fabrics he could produce. This protected established masters but strangled growth. At the same time, demand was exploding. Europe's population was rebounding from the Black Death, and urban markets were swelling. Foreign merchants wanted cheaper cloth in larger quantities, not just the fine, slow-made luxury wools the guilds prized. Enterprising cloth merchants began looking for ways around the guilds. They found them in the countryside. Merchants started delivering raw wool to rural households and paying villagers to spin and weave it. Outside the guild-regulated towns, this putting out system, or Verlag system in German, bypassed the strict urban guilds entirely. Peasant families who had once woven only for themselves now worked for distant merchants who collected their cloth, finished it in town, and sold it on international markets. The system spread rapidly. By the 1500s, tens of thousands of rural looms were humming across northern Europe. It shattered the monopoly of the guilds. City weavers saw their wages fall as rural production undercut them. Guilds tried to ban the practice, but merchants and monarchs protected it because it was profitable and flexible. The ume that had once symbolized urban citizenship now drifted back into the countryside, transformed into a cog of global commerce as competition sharpened. Innovation accelerated, but often in secret. Some weavers experimented with faster treadle looms or broader warp beams to produce wider cloth. Others adopted new spinning wheels that could twist thread many times faster than a hand spindle. Guilds fought these changes, fearing they would lower quality or threaten jobs. But outside the guild towns and villages and merchant-financed workshops, new methods spread. Anyway, by the 16th century, the pace of weaving had doubled or tripled in some regions. Cloth grew cheaper, plainer, and more abundant. It filled not only royal wardrobes, but peasant chests. Textiles were ceasing to be luxuries. They were becoming necessities. This shift carried deep social consequences. Urban weaving families who had risen into comfort found themselves undercut by rural laborers paid less. Guilds splintered into feuding factions of conservative masters and desperate journeymen. Strikes and riots shook Ghent, Bruges, and Florence at the same time. Rural weaving blurred the old boundary between household and market. Peasant families wove at night after tending fields, their children carding wool under the table. Money seeped into the village economy, but so did dependence. Where once weaving had bound communities together, it now began to divide them, even as the old structures crumbled. Cloth powered new ones. Governments taxed textile exports to fund wars. Banking families like the Medici rose on profits from woolen cloth. Overseas trade routes, soon to stretch to India and the Americas, relied on sails and canvas woven by European looms. Cloth became the quiet engine of empire. Ships carried it outward as trade goods and brought back dyes, cotton and silk, to feed the looms. In return, weaving, once a household survival skill, had become the fuel of global expansion. By the end of the 15th century, a visitor could walk through the cloth districts of Ghent or Florence and hear the relentless clatter of looms from dawn to dusk. Bolts of wool stacked like cordwood filled warehouses. It seemed eternal, but already hints of the future were stirring. Experiments with water-powered fulling mills, rumors of looms driven by water wheels, spinning machines that could twist dozens of threads at once. No one could yet imagine the thunder of the mechanized textile mills that would roar in the 18th century. But their roots lay herein, the patient foot-pumping of medieval treadles, in the relentless discipline of guild workshops, in the quiet monotony of the weaver's days. The 14th century weaver never saw this future. She measured her world in inches of cloth and hours of light. Yet every shuttle she threw nudged Europe closer to the modern world. She showed that human time could be compressed into objects, that daily labor could be split into tasks and recombined at scale. The logic of her loom, the steady accumulation of tiny motions into vast results, would become the logic of industry itself. She is long forgotten, but her threads still run through every seam of the world you wear. The desert is still dark when the first voices rise. A faint gray light outlines the cliffs on the west bank of the Nile. The air is cool for now, though by noon it will be blistering. You are standing in Deir el, the workers' village that served the Valley of the Kings during Egypt's New Kingdom around 1200 BC. It is a narrow rectangle of mud brick houses tucked against the desert hills. Each house is low and flat-roofed, with whitewashed walls and a single wooden door. Inside, men are waking on reed mats, their wives stoking small bread ovens, children rubbing sleep from their eyes. Soon the men will walk single file through the desert gate to the cliffs, where they will spend the day, carving the eternal resting places of pharaohs. They are tomb builders, the invisible hands behind Egypt's most famous monuments. The men of Deir el-Medina lived unusual lives for ancient workers. They were skilled craftsmen, stonecutters, plasterers, painters, draftsmen, and they were organized into permanent crews employed by the royal state, while most Egyptians lived scattered in villages along the Nile. These men lived in this isolated walled settlement, guarded and provisioned by the pharaoh's administration. Their seclusion protected the secrets of the royal tombs they carved, and shielded them from contact with grave robbers or foreign spies. Their work was considered sacred. They were called servants in the place of truth because their hands shaped the passage between mortal life and the afterlife. Yet their daily lives were ordinary, even tedious. They rose before sunrise, walked to the tomb site, and worked by flickering oil lamps in narrow rock corridors. The splendor of Egypt's golden age rested on the monotony of their labor. After a quick meal of flatbread and beer, the crew gathers outside the village gate. A scribe checks each man's name against the attendance list. Absence is noted. An unexcused absence can mean loss of pay. They walk in silence along the dusty path to the Valley of the Kings, their tools slung over their shoulders: copper chisels, dolerite pounding stones, wooden mallets, baskets for rubble. The cliffs loom above them like petrified waves. At the sight, they descend into the cool darkness of the tomb in progress. The air smells of stone dust and lamp smoke. Each man takes his place. Quarrymen at the front chip away at the raw rock. Behind them, stonecutters smooth the walls with bronze ADSs. Further back, plasterers coat the surface with white gypsum, and draftsmen sketch red grid lines and outlines of figures for the painters to follow. The tomb is both a workplace and a tunnel into eternity, but to its builders, it is simply where they spend most of their lives. Work runs on a strict schedule, 10 days on, then 2 days off. Each workday begins at dawn and ends around sunset, with brief pauses for bread and beer. The crews are divided into left and right gangs, each responsible for one side of the tomb. Rivalry is fierce. Records show they competed to outpace each other's progress, though neither side could finish until the other kept up. The noise is constant. the clang of copper chisels on limestone, the thud of mallets, the hiss of sand poured to keep saws from sticking. Dust clings to their sweat. Their arms ache, their backs knot. The tomb inches forward by millimeters. Progress is glacial. A large royal tomb can take decades to complete, outlasting the reigns of the kings who commissioned them. A man may spend his whole career in the same corridor, carving the same figures over and over, until he can recite every crack in the stone from memory. Watching everything are the scribes. They stand with pallets of reed pens and ink, recording the workers' attendance, output, rations, and tools. They tally the number of limestone blocks removed each week. Note who sharpened how many chisels and who carried how many baskets of rubble. If a man is sick, they write it down. If he skips work to brew beer or argue with his wife, they write that too. These records, written on flakes of limestone called asp, still survive by the thousands making. Deir el-Medina, one of the best documented communities of the ancient world. Through them, we see the relentless bureaucracy behind the grandeur. Every painted pharaoh and golden tomb mask began as a line on a scribe's list. The men are paid not in coins. Egypt had none yet, but in goods. Sacks of grain, jars of beer, bundles of firewood, cuts of meat from the temple herds. Each worker receives fixed rations based on ranks: chief workmen at the top, apprentices at the bottom. These rations support their entire families who live with them in the village. The system is precise but brittle. If rations are late, work stops. Surviving records show workers staging strikes, laying down their tools, and sitting in the tomb corridors until officials arrive with food. They are among the first recorded strikers in history. Even eternity had to wait when their stomachs were empty by midday. The desert outside is blazing, but inside the tomb the light is dim and the air cool. The workers' world has shrunk to the few feet of rock before their eyes. They are building something designed to last forever. Yet their own lives are brief and mostly invisible. No one will carve their names in gold or paint their faces on the tomb walls. Still, their fingerprints are everywhere, in chisel marks on ceilings, in thumbprints pressed into drying plaster, in the faint smoke stains on the corridor roofs from their lamps. They are anonymous, but they have bent the bedrock of the world to their hands. As the sun sets, they trudge back to the village, lay down their tools, and step into the soft glow of oil lamps. The tomb waits in silence until they return. But how did this isolated village of workers, so ordinary in their daily lives, come to build the grandest monuments of the ancient world with such precision and permanence? The next day dawns the same, gray light creeping over the cliffs, the smell of baking bread in the narrow alleys of Deir el-Medina, the crunch of sandals on the desert path. The routine never changes, but the work creeps forward. Stone by stone, to modern eyes, the tombs of Egypt look inevitable, colossal, and perfect, as if they had always existed. But to the men who built them, they were a daily battle against rock, dust, fatigue, and time itself. The first stage of tomb construction was excavation, and it was brutally slow. Crews used copper chisels, wooden mallets, and dolerite pounding stones to cut into the limestone cliffs. The tools were simple but effective when wielded in relentless repetition. Workers chipped away a few centimeters at a time, hauling rubble out in woven baskets on their shoulders. Others fanned away the choking dust with palm fronds. In the narrow tunnels, the air grew hot and stale. Oil lamps burned oxygen and filled the chambers with smoke. Men emerged with blackened nostrils and gritty throats, gulping water from ceramic jars before descending again. Progress was measured not in days, but in cubits of rock removed. A single burial chamber might take years just to hollow out. They called this labor cutting, and it consumed most of their lives. Once the rough chambers were cut, the artistry began. Stonecutters smoothed the walls with copper adzes. Then plasterers coated them in fine white gypsum. Draftsmen ruled red grid lines across the surfaces, using knotted cords to keep their proportions true. Artists then sketched outlines of gods, spirits, and scenes from the Book of the Dead. Every figure had to be placed in the correct register and face the proper direction. Following sacred conventions older than memory, painters filled the outlines with pigments ground from minerals: red ochre for skin, malachite green for plants, azurite blue for the sky, carbon black for hair and outlines, and powdered gold for divine flesh. They mixed the pigments with water and gum arabic, applying them in layers with reed brushes. The process demanded absolute precision. A single misaligned figure could offend the gods and jeopardize the pharaoh's passage into the afterlife. Each chamber became a silent encyclopedia of rituals, prayers, and myths, etched and painted by men who often could not read them. Behind the artists were unseen engineers who planned the entire tomb as a structure. Royal tombs were carefully oriented to align with stars or cardinal directions. Corridors were angled to prevent flooding from rare desert rains. Ventilation shafts carried away smoke and heat. Surveyors laid out the design with plumb lines, levels, and knotted cords. Every angle, every slope was calculated by hand and marked in red on the rock. The builders had no blueprints. They carried the whole design in memory and markings on the walls. A single mistake in measurement could doom the entire project. Yet such mistakes are astonishingly rare. Their precision has outlasted empires. The entire process ran under strict bureaucratic control. Scribes tracked every stage: how many cubits excavated, how many days spent plastering, how many jars of pigment issued, how many chisels sharpened. Each tool was signed out and signed back in. Supply caravans trudged from the Nile, carrying wood for scaffolds, oil for lamps, gypsum cloth for dust screens, and food for the men. Foremen issued these supplies according to official lists and reported shortfalls to Thebes. The rhythm was military. Tomb building was treated like a campaign against chaos, planned, rationed, and audited. Even eternity had paperwork.